Hello, and welcome to the Parlour podcast, where we explore human flourishing at work and in life. I'm your host, John Barnes, and today I'm speaking to Graham Allcott about his book, Kind, The Quiet Power of Kindness at Work. So as you'll discover in more depth soon, Graham's book focuses on why organisations with kinder and more human-centred cultures are ultimately more successful. Graham's perhaps best known as the best-selling author of How to Be a Productivity Ninja, and he's the co-founder of Think Productive. Our conversation today covered both leadership and team development, as well as life in general. And I think that's why I loved it so much. I think we struck a really nice balance between, on the one side, finding the applications and implications for kindness at work, particularly for leaders, as well as more generally discussing the topic philosophically and looking at broader society and life itself and the role of kindness in life today. Amongst many things, we discussed the difference between being kind and being nice and how they're pretty different things, almost opposites, according to Graham in some senses. The importance of psychological safety in teams and how kindness is really key to creating that. How a lack of kindness often comes from scarcity mindset, particularly being in a rush, as opposed to an abundance mindset. And we spoke about a few of Graham's 8 principles for what he calls kindfulness. We particularly spoke about slowing down, about humility, about self-care, about listening. And finally, we spoke about the importance of kindness towards people who we disagree with the most, particularly in these polarizing times. So whether you're a leader who's looking to create really empowered, high-performing teams, or whether you just want to listen to a smart, kind guy offer some great pearls of wisdom for life itself, I think you'll find this conversation really valuable. So with that said, I now want to introduce you to Graham Allcott. Hello, Graham. Welcome.
How you doing? Good to be here.
Thanks for joining. So I want our conversation. Listeners will have, got a good intro about you before this, so we don't need to do all that. But I would love to focus our conversation on kind, which I've got here and I read before over the Christmas break. Yeah, you were on my bedside table every night. But before we get into it, can you give listeners a bit of a plotted history as to how you got to do whatever it is that you're doing now, however you describe it?
Wow, potted history. Okay, so I went to a university where student volunteering was very heavily promoted. Got into doing loads of that, and then fell into jobs promoting student volunteering and supporting student volunteers for quite a few years. Ended up doing things like advising the UK government and writing some bits of education policy for the old Labour government back in the day. And then I was chief executive of a charity at a really young age, and I had skipped out the whole being a middle manager bit. I'd just gone straight to being the top leader in the organization. And when I left that job, I went freelance for a bit, thinking I'll sort of move back into another charity. And one day I was sat at my desk at home, having ideas, as I would always do. And then I turned around to find the people who would implement the ideas and realized I was in my spare bedroom at home and there was no one to help. And realized I had a problem with productivity in that moment. So I had, because I'd skipped out middle management, I got really good at having the ideas and driving things forward and being the strategic person. But I just couldn't do the completer finisher stuff at all. And so fixed me, which looked like doing lots of experimentation and kind of figuring out what worked. And then people started to say to me, oh, so how come you reply to your emails on time now and you didn't used to? And I said, well, I've started doing all this experimentation around productivity. And people were like, we need that. And so that is literally the journey of how I started a business called Think Productive in 2009. And since then, we've been building that business all around the world, working with everyone from eBay to Barclays to Audi to Disney to big companies, right through to charities and small businesses too. And it's all essentially been about helping people to make space for what matters, which is my definition of productivity. And then in the sort of course of building that business, what I was really lucky um, with in the early part of my career is that I worked for a couple of leaders, and then I worked sort of in collaboration with a couple of leaders who are running other charities as well, who were just like super inspiring in terms of how they built trust and loyalty and safety within their teams. And those early experiences really set the tone for then how I built Think Productive. So we've always had as one of our corporate values, trust and kindness are our rocket fuel. And that's been one of our value statements, for a long time. And a few years ago, I was doing a keynote talk about productivity, and someone said to me, "Hey, how do you run your business?" This was like the last question of a Q&A, and I just didn't really know what to answer because I was so used to talking about the stuff that was in my book, Productivity Ninja, and all of this, and I didn't really talk about my approach to my own business that much. And then I just said from the stage, I just said, well, kindness is everything. When you're kind, you win. It's as simple as that. And I don't really know where those words came from. It just kind of spilled out of me. And it launched a massive divide in the room, like 5 minutes before the end of my keynote, where most of the room was divided into two camps. Most of them were on my team, which was just Team Kind. And then there was like about 25% of people who were on team Screw Them All and Be Evil. And they started saying things like, yeah, but like business is dog eat dog. And we've watched The Wolf of Wall Street. And, there was all this kind of, hatred and defiance towards the idea that kindness had any place in business, or that you could use kindness as the basis to build leadership and build teams. And I sort of went away from this keynote where lots of people came up to me afterwards and they were like, oh yeah, the kindness thing. People were really enthused by it. But just noticing how sort of polarizing that had been and thinking, there is a book in there. Right? So that was the birthplace of Kind. It was a keynote I did in Rome for a client. They were investment bankers. So even in a room of investment bankers, 75% of people were on Team Kind. So I think that tells you something straight away that's quite important. But yeah, that was about 5 years ago. And then I basically have been, writing and researching and then releasing this book. So the book came out just over a year ago and won a couple of awards at the end of last year, which was very nice, including Leadership Book of the Year. But yeah, my work now really is around sort of moving away from talking about productivity and talking much more about this idea of kindness at work, kindfulness, and kindful leadership.
So can you say a bit more about, because when I saw that you'd written a book about kind, like I've known you for years and known you as, like, to me, you are the productivity ninja. And so, that feels like quite a left-brained, hyper-rational, doing focus, masculine archetype type thing to be focusing on productivity. I don't know, conjures like life hacks and inbox zero and all sorts of other methods. And then when I saw you'd written about kind, I was like, okay, that feels like a shift. It feels soft, from hard to soft, from left to right brain, from doing to being. So could you just speak a bit about that, either the journey from one to the other, although I think you've just shared a bit about that, but also what it's been like for you doing that? Because it must feel like a different mode you're in somewhat.
Yeah, and I like the masculine feminine thing. So Productivity Ninja, which is the book on my shelf behind me there, you can see that there's a little guy with a paperclip that's, the paperclip is sort of signifying some kind of dagger or weapon. Productivity generally has a bit of a masculine sort of energy around it and a sort of coalescence around it. And then kindness, on the other hand, does have quite a feminine energy to it. There's a lot of people talk about how when you buy kids' pajamas, the boys' pajamas are always dinosaurs and trucks and very masculine, sort of aggressive things. And then the girls' pajamas are like princesses, and it doesn't say like be strong and be brave. It says be kind, right? So yeah, there is a little bit of a as people think that it's a bit of a leap, or it's a bit of a there's a bit of a gap between those two things. I think there's a massive bridge between those two things, though. And the bridge for me is that what I've really noticed over the years, and then researching the book, what I found was there's a lot of science that backs this up, is that leaders who build the trust and consensus and are really more focused on the listening than they are, there's more focused on that kind of yin energy and kind of listening than they are on the kind of yang energy, um, of being kind of brutal, kind of like just drive it forward, sort of aggressors. Those are the leaders that build stronger teams and high performance and better creativity, and all of this stuff kind of stems from: do you have a team that trusts you? Do you have a team that cooperates well? Do you have a team where there's psychological safety? So, ultimately on an individual level, yes, you need sometimes to cut through the crap and be aggressive, and you need to screen out the rest of the world and sort of shut the world out so you can do your deep work. And it's quite individualistic, and it can be quite kind of aggressive in that way. But on a team level, if you want to perform well, and you're the leader of a team, or you're part of a team where the performance of that team really matters to you, then it really is much more about listening and cooperation and exploring the interdependence that people have, and sort of recognizing that there's sort of truth and meaning like far beyond our own individual realm. So yeah, I think there's a massive bridge between the two. And yeah, I've worked with so many leaders over the years that really get that and really understand that. And it was just a pleasure to be able to sort of highlight some of them as part of Kind, and kind of go back and reminisce with some of them about like moments that we'd both sort of shared in our careers and things like that. So yeah, it was a lovely book in that respect for me.
Nice. So you got to bond with some old colleagues over it.
Yeah.
That's really nice. Can you, as you say this, two thoughts are coming through my mind. One is how absurd it is that we feel it. I felt that reading the beginning of your book, that you felt you had to explain why kindness is a good thing to do. And I was just thinking, where are we at that we have to have evidence for why to be kind, rather than just like it just feels better when we are. But we could get into that. But I'm wondering if you could define it, because I think there are ways of understanding kindness that are quite misleading, actually, and I know you cover that a little bit.
Yeah. So let me
Maybe
say
what it's not.
Yeah, the definitions are really important. In a sense, they're not important at all, right? So in a sense, it's about, like someone's just felt sense of what they should do. But I think the definitions are really important when we're advocating for kindness. So yeah, a couple of things about that. Couple of definitions. So my colleague Christina Kisley, who I work with on a program called Kindful Leadership, she gave me this one, and she said kindness is about truth and grace. So it's about recognizing that there's a truth of a situation. Someone is in need. Someone needs something. I need to speak up, like whatever that truth is. But marrying that with the grace, which is really about like dignity and care and empathy. One of the dictionary definitions, which I really love, is kindness is about limiting the damage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a really interesting insight in there, particularly at work, where most of what we do in a team will create some kind of collateral damage along the way, right? So even if it's just that there's one person in the team who's really holding on to one particular version of things or one particular idea, and we're going with something else, like even if the something else is better, that person might come away feeling a little bit bruised. So there's something there for me about just recognizing that there's always damage, and how we limit it can be a really helpful way to think. And then the third thing, just in terms of definitions, is to define it by what it's not, which is there's a difference between nice and kind. So I mentioned kindness is about truth and grace. Niceness is where you just skip the truth part, right? So the nice sort of approach to things is just to make sure everyone's happy. Don't, upset the apple cart. Don't rock the boat. Like all those kind of phrases that we have. But it's essentially about just avoiding truth in order to promote comfort. So really good example of this at work would be, let's say you're like in a meeting and your colleague is presenting or promoting, and they're sort of, they've got their PowerPoint slides and they're sort of presenting stuff, and then at the end of the talk, like, you realize, and you look around and realize, and everyone else realizes, it didn't go well. Like, the colleague didn't get their point across. Maybe there's a sort of frosty atmosphere, like whatever. But the person's on high adrenaline and they've just been presenting to everybody. So they come out of the meeting, and as you're sort of walking out the room, they just say, "How did I do? Was it good?" And in that moment, you've got a fork in the road, right? And that fork in the road is nice versus kind. So in that moment, if you want to just take the easy route is the nice route. And the easy route just goes, "Yeah, it was great. Full stop, end of story," you move on. So what you've done there is you've completely shirked truth in order to promote comfort for you and comfort for them, right? The kind response to that is really, really different. So you recognize in that moment as you walk out the room and they go, "How did I do?" You recognize in that moment they're going to be adrenaline dumping. Now is not the time to give them difficult feedback. So you have a little conversation with them and say, "Yeah, there was some great bits. There were some other bits I've got some thoughts around. Let's meet tomorrow or the next day." So you do it while it's fresh in their minds. You then take time out of your schedule, which is not comfortable for you, because you've got a million other things you could do. And in that time, you have a really brave conversation where you say, "Here are the things that could have gone better. Here's the even better if. Here's the stuff that was good." So you have that feedback conversation. And again, it's about truth and grace. It's about, here's the truth, but I'm going to deliver that in a way that is limiting the damage as much as I possibly can. So, when people talk about kindness being weakness or soft, like, to me, that's total badass behavior, right? To be able to have the skill to have that kind of conversation, the bravery to have that conversation, the generosity to have that conversation, because it takes time. Like, that for me is the stuff that really bonds teams together. And often it's in the more difficult moments or the more busy moments where you have the bigger opportunities to act with kindness in a way that is going to build that trust and that loyalty and that performance as well.
I mean, it strikes me that actually niceness in that moment is definitely an easy option. And
it's
kindness,
the cowardly option.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking about this with a client yesterday about your book, and she goes, "Kindness is telling someone they've got spinach in their teeth." No, I was like, that is class, because I can totally imagine being in a situation, full well your mate's got some spinach in their teeth or whatever, and you just can't tell them, you just can't say it. And
that's a good one. It's truth and grace, right? It's like,
right.
how do you deliver that? You probably make a little
Right.
joke where you go, "If I had spinach in my teeth, like, would you tell me?" And when they go, "Oh, maybe," you go, "Well, you have
You've got
to
spinach in your
find a way
teeth.
of, like, delivering that with grace." And that person goes, "Graham's got my back. John's got my back."
Yeah, so the truth part is the hard part, and in terms of hard, like it can feel harsh or something. The grace part is the nuance. It's like the art and delivery of that. And I feel like nuance seeking is actually quite a big part of kindness. You speak a little bit about this self-other tension, basically, that when we do things for ourselves, it's kind of by default less kind than if we're really trying to do right by the other. However, if we're always doing what's right by the other, probably starting to be people pleasers or be nice, which is just incredibly common. And the real problem with people pleasing is that ultimately others suffer from my own people pleasing. Like, if I'm continuously caring for others' needs and not my own, there comes a point where you're going to have to come and rescue me because my needs have been unmet for so long.
Yeah, and also people who do that a lot, they become the martyrs. They
There's a
become
victim
the
mentality.
people full of resentment, and and it becomes like almost a passive aggressive thing for them to keep people pleasing, because they know they're going to people please and then also bitch about the fact that they're having to do it.
Yeah. It reminds me, there's a great related. This is Mathieu Ricard, the French Tibetan Buddhist monk, and he talks about the difference between empathy and compassion. And there's some brain scans on people where they ask them to exhibit empathy. So typically, I think they show images of suffering children, and they ask them to feel what those people feel, which is empathy. So empathy is
Yeah.
It's sometimes called theory of mind. It's just to understand the way someone else feels, and you kind of take on that emotion. So there's a smart version of empathy, which is hopefully I understand roughly how you feel, so we can work well together. But there's a dumb version of empathy, which is you feel sad, so now I feel sad too. It's more like emotional contagion. But compassion, on the other hand, is I sense that you're not feeling great, and all I want to do is wish that you feel better. Like I want that to change. And they find that when people leave the scanner having done compassion meditation, they've got more energy than when they went into the scanner. Whereas when they do empathy, they've got less energy. And so he was studying this for caregivers. Like
Yeah.
if you're a caregiver and you're just empathic all the time or nice all the time, you're going to suffer a lot. But actually, if you're kind, hopefully both people get all the benefit from that. It strikes me that
Yeah.
that self-other dichotomy is very similar to what you're talking about.
Yeah. Do you know, as you're saying that, the other thing that I was just thinking about is how big and how small the world is matters with this stuff. So, like, I end up talking to quite a few, leaders and people on LinkedIn who've read my book, or sort of commenting on posts that I've written and things like that. Where now is not a good time to be an empath, right?
Mm.
Like
Hmm.
when you're exposed to news and politics that you don't like and all these things that are going on, it's almost like it's the booby prize of life to be someone who's like really empathetic. And I think there's something about how big, how kind of small we've made the world by the connective technology that we have, where I don't think the human brain has ever in history been used to being exposed to like that much need or that many things to be empathetic about. And it's no surprise that you've got people like Elon Musk saying that empathy is the disease of humanity and the sort of flaw in the matrix of humanity and all this kind of stuff. Because I think, at the heart of what we need to do if we're empathetic people is reduce the size of the world so that we're in operating on a kind of village level rather than the world level, and then we can kind of get we can feel that sense of discomfort when we feel empathy towards someone locally, but we'll have the compassion to act on that and do something about that locally. There's just so much that we're being shown that we just don't know what to do with, and it's difficult to feel like anything that we can do is going to make any kind of difference. So I think there's something really interesting about how we see the world. Like I'm definitely thinking a lot at the moment about how to bring. I've always been someone who's like, yeah, change the world and think big and be ambitious for what you want to do. And I just read Rutger Bregman's book just before Christmas called Moral Ambition, which basically says lots of smart people are wasting their careers doing jobs that no one really needs. Management consultancy, and he has this whole list of bankers and all these different jobs where it's like, well, no one really needs those things. Like we need smart people to be solving the big problems in the world. And so I've always been someone who believes that and wants to think big and wants to have ambition around that stuff. But at the moment, I just have this real human instinct towards how do I do things on a much smaller level? How do I just operate within my community, even within like the roads that I live on? How can I make connections there? Like how can I sort of, and I think where that comes from is just wanting to have like more control over those things, because it just feels like anything beyond anything beyond your road or your town is just like so out of control.
Yeah, and I think as the world's become more globalized, our circle of concern has got bigger,
Yeah.
but our circle of influence hasn't changed all that much. And actually, if you want to have an impact, then going local is probably a great way to do it. It depends on the person's
Yeah.
kind of leverage. I'm thinking I heard this story of a leadership session in a massive, like C-suite of a massive multinational, and they had a guest come in who was a monk, and he asked everyone their purpose. And this guy, one of the leaders, this massive corporation, says, "I want to change the world." And the monk's answer was, "Why so big?" And essentially what he points to is A, impact, but B, your ego. Like, do you want to change the world for the world, or do you want to change the world because you did it?
Yeah,
And he goes, oh, why so big? I thought it was such a great answer.
yeah. I love that. Yeah, and there's always been that thing for me with like sort of working in charities in the early part of my career. Like you come across a lot of those people who they are very driven by getting the MBE, or just kind of seeming like they're helping a lot, or a hero in certain situations and stuff. And so I think when you're sort of working in that world, you get very conscious of like what everyone else's motivations are, but then also like just digging deep, like what are your motivations? Are you doing it for the right reasons? So yeah, and I think that links back to kindness in general. So I talk about in the book, um, it's just a little section, but just around authentic kindness. And there's a lot of stuff online that people can get cynical about when it comes to kindness. The sort of hashtag be kind thing, where you'll see people using hashtag be kind and they're almost using it passive aggressively, or they're using it and then they're bad mouthing someone else in the comments 5 minutes later and all that sort of thing. And I think with kindness, it's worth remembering that like people are not stupid. People see through inauthentic kindness very quickly. So when people sort of ask me questions like, what do you do when someone is weaponizing kindness, or when someone is using kindness, as a sort of passive aggressive tool and stuff? It's like, well, they'll get found out like really quickly. People will know.
Mm.
And I think it's always worth just like checking yourself in terms of your own actions. Is like, am I really doing this for the right reason? And I think as long as you feel like what your intent is good, and you're taking action towards marrying up impact and intent, then you're probably along the right lines. But it's always a good self check to have, I
Mm.
think. Yeah.
And from a leadership perspective, in your research, well, what is it that like particularly came up as the value of kindfulness? Again, I think it's absurd that we want to measure everything these days, including that
Yeah.
being decent is useful in the workplace. I'd imagine sustainability would that's in terms of the long term success of a team or something might be one. But tell me more. What's the evidence kind of saying around this way of leading?
Yeah. So on the evidence part, so the first half of the book is really me addressing team screw them all and be evil. So I actually had that keynote in Rome in my head, and I was thinking that what was going to happen with this book was like, who's going to buy a book about kindness at work, right? It's not going to be unkind people trying to use
Mm,
it as a self-help tool and become kind. It's
mm,
going to be bought by people who already feel like kindness at work is undervalued, or or it's a big part of the way they operate, and they're going to buy it to give to their bosses, to give to people in positions of power or leverage, and they're going to be saying, "Hey, we need to do it more like this." Um, so I was thinking about who's the person receiving that book, and the person on the receiving end of that book might be slightly more cynical, but they also might be, if they're slightly sort of higher up the hierarchy in an organization, or they're, someone who's making those kind of decisions, they might want data. So, like, I was really conscious that the first half of the book needed to be not just here's how we make the case for kindness, but also here's how we make the case for kindness at work, and here's how it affects things at work. One of the best studies that I found around this was a team at Google. So Google did this really big study where they looked at all their different teams, and they looked at what made different teams successful. And what they found was, where you had high levels of kindness in the team, and matched that with high levels of empathy, then what you found was it developed more psychological safety. And they had determined in Google that like prioritizing psychological safety above every other measure was how you got more successful teams at Google. So that means putting psychological safety and a sense of psychological safety and trust within the team, above what talent do you have on the team, how many people do you have on the team, what resources does the team have, all these other things that you would think about as being pretty central to the success of a team. They come below having psychological safety in the team, and that's what they found. So in the book, what I talk about is these links between kindness and empathy building trust, which is a one-to-one transaction, and then trust building that psychological safety, which is a one-to-many transaction. So one-to-many meaning, if I'm in this team, I need to feel like everybody's got my back. If I'm going to then step forward and like share a difficult bit of feedback, or share a brave idea that feels a bit harebrained or feels a bit risky. And, that's what you need. If you want to have better ideas, better critical thinking, if you want to have a sense that people are going to cooperate with each other, support each other when times are difficult, psychological safety is just at the heart of all of that. So that was probably the big thing in researching the book, was just how important psychological safety is. And we spend a lot of time talking about that terminology now. Like, it's become a thing that is like it's a phrase that people hear a lot in businesses. It's become a bit of a buzzword thing, but there's often a bit of a gap between the amount of enthusiasm for it as a sort of conceptual idea, and then like, okay, what's the work that we actually have to do to create that and make it happen? And what you find is when you dig into that, the ways that people become psychologically safe are basic kindness, right? So it's like supporting people, listening to people, like, checking in with their ideas, like all these things contribute to psychological safety. So that was really the main bit of the science that just comes up over and over again, and all the different things that become prevalent positively when you have a more psychologically safe team.
Yeah, I believe it's they had IQ. Even the IQ of a team was less important than psychological safety. They thought gender balance might have something to do with it, and that didn't have anything to do with it, etc., etc. And they end up there. I'm up for discussing actually two things here. On the one side, it's really interesting to talk about how one creates psychological safety. Equally, I have some. Definitely, with the way it's being spoken about, I've got some hefty reservations at the moment, which is that the evidence is like very clear. When a group feels safe, essentially, I believe what happened at Google is they found that the teams that reported making the most mistakes did the best. And it was like, well, how are they making more mistakes but doing better? And it's like, well, they're not making more mistakes. They feel safe to report them, i.e. that nothing's going under the rug because they feel safe. And therefore they grow and improve. So you can totally see that logic, particularly in an innovative organization.
Yeah, where psychological safety really matters is where physical safety is,
of course,
at threat, right? So again, having people. So I interviewed David Marquet, who wrote the book "Turn the Ship Around." So he's a American Navy captain, and gets put on a ship that he doesn't understand. And he's the captain of the ship, but everybody else knows the ship better than he does. And so turning the ship around is this whole thing of turning around the idea that he should bark orders from the top and that everybody else should follow. And sort of realizing that what he needs to do is actually not give any orders, but to question and to listen and to be curious about how stuff works. And, that's how you then reduce or eliminate physical accidents. So organizations that are putting people on the front line in medical emergencies, in warfare, or even just things like building projects and construction, and all these industries where safety is a sort of key concern. Like, you'll see the focus there, where it becomes, if you see the slightest thing that you feel uncomfortable about, like, raise the alarm. Don't be afraid to do that. And you'll see the messaging. If you walk around a building site, it's kind of all over the place, trying to just instill in you this idea of like, please do put your hand up. Please don't feel like, well, I might upset my boss, or this isn't my place to say, or I don't know, it's probably nothing. Like, just, the whole training is like, remove those kind of thoughts from your head. And even if it is nothing, like, well done for sort of volunteering the information. And like, that becomes I think, a really important thing in organizations, in like how do you marry psychological safety and physical safety, because they really go hand in hand.
I mean, there's that amazing story. I'll put this in the show notes. There's an NPR podcast. It was on Invisibilia. It was crazy. It was about a Shell oil rig where they had so many deaths, people working on the oil rig, and eventually they got a facilitator. I believe she might have been blind or half blind, and she was a Holocaust survivor. And she got these men to sit in circles and talk about their feelings. And the number of accidents just dropped dramatically over the course of months, and it was phenomenal. And some of the experiences these men describe are remarkable. It's like real clear effect on psychological safety and therefore on actual safety. But I think that's where my bugbear comes in, is the way it's discussed today. First of all, when someone says, I don't feel safe, the effect of that is to make nobody in the room feel safe either. Right? It's immediately like, is there a tiger around? I hadn't seen one, but apparently now there might be one. That could be one effect. But the other one is, I've heard this great idea that growth, which in biology is called hormesis, it's like the biology behind what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, is when you feel safe but uncomfortable. Right? If you feel safe but comfortable, nothing happens. If you feel unsafe, of course, the system can break. But if you feel safe but uncomfortable, that's where growth comes. And I think there's a lot of conflating safety and comfort, where we might want safety, but actually what we're wanting is comfort. And the good work, the kind work, is that we're safe here, and I'm going to do the uncomfortable thing. I'm going to tell my friend they've got spinach in their teeth, right? And that's really different. I think in culture at the moment, as it's made its way into like everyday language, it's started to mean everything needs to feel comfortable. You can't confront somebody on something. Of course, the ways we do that matter enormously. But I wonder what you think about that difference between safety and comfort.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And yeah, there's that sort of classic sort of learning model where it talks about your comfort zone, and then your risk zone, and then your danger zone, right?
Right.
Three areas, and often, particularly where there's conflict or disagreement, or you've got sort of competing ideas, and it's about trying to work out what the best combination of things is. You do need people to be a little bit in that sense of discomfort, or maybe in a sort of slightly taking a risk kind of zone, right? Like the whole thing with psychological safety is people feel comfortable to take risks. It doesn't eliminate the need to take risks. I also think I like what you're saying about when someone says, I don't feel safe, that everyone's looking around for a tiger, because I do think there's also no one ever says, I don't feel psychologically safe. What they say is, I don't feel safe. And I do think there's a difference there, because I think what happens
between physical and emotional, or physical,
and maybe what people should be saying in that moment is, I don't feel comfortable, or I don't feel supported, might be another word. But there are probably situations where people would lean on the word safe, when actually that's maybe not really true if they kind of thought about it a little bit more. I think it's a really interesting area, isn't it? And I think this is where our spidey senses come into play as well.
Yeah,
where,
agreed.
It depends much more on the situation than it does necessarily on the terminology, I think. But yeah, I think there's often areas when we sort of look at particular terminology or particular fads that come along, where things go a bit too far, or like it sort of swings the pendulum from one way to the other, and it goes a little bit too far. And
I've heard people say safe space, right, and then say something utterly outrageous.
Right,
Right, well, just because it's safe doesn't mean that you can just say something really harsh about someone who's not here.
and when we think about why safe spaces exist, they come from very well-intentioned places,
Of course.
and there are arguments for certain spaces being preserved as safe spaces, right? Like, quite obviously. But I think there's there's often what happens in those situations is people just think that comes for free.
Mm.
And so a safe space was only safe last time someone made it safe.
Mm.
And so then if you're rocking up to the meeting the following week, it's not a safe space until the person chairing that meeting or the person in charge has set it up that way again, right? Like these things are, and same with psychological safety, needs this constant
Oh yeah, it's work.
like preserving
Yeah.
and sort of reassuring, because what was psychologically safe last week might be unsafe next week. So I think there's always this sort of sense of relentlessness to it. We need to keep coming back to it. And what that means is sometimes people will get tired of that. And sometimes people will be too relentless with it as well. And it kind of needs to just be pulled back a little bit if the emphasis is too much. So I think that's where we have to just use our own instincts a bit more. And also maybe just sort of there's the group, but also check in with members of the group about what that experience is like for them, particularly if you're always the facilitator or the leader
Mm.
and the person sort of curating whatever the space is just check in with one person about, what's this feel like to be on the other side of it. And I think that's like a general thing with kindness as well, is one of my colleagues has this lovely phrase, which is, what's it like to be on the other end of me?
Mm.
And I think this book really, I was thinking about that phrase a lot and sort of thinking about what does that mean for me personally? But it's a question that we probably all should ask ourselves a bit more, or don't ask ourselves enough.
Yeah, I mean it's a great heuristic for self-awareness, isn't it? What's it like coming into touch with me
Yeah.
each day? I'm keen to get some some of the kindfulness principles for our listeners, and I thought a way we could do it is when we're talking about psychological safety, which is, like, it sounds from what you're saying, like downstream from kindness potentially. One issue I have is that it's a paradox, is that it's often almost described as the leader will make this space safe. That's the leader's job, to make this safe, which isn't how culture works. It's totally co-created. The other thing is you can make a space as safe as possible. A lot of us are in incredibly safe spaces. In terms of historically, like, it probably doesn't get safer than a lot of places now. And yet it's possible to feel unsafe, and that's actually someone's individual psychology that's at play, not the collective one. And yet the paradox is that the leader has a disproportionate effect on the safety of a group. And so, could you speak to some of the kindfulness principles that can allow a leader to start to even, 10% create a more safe and kind environment?
Wow, that's a lovely setup for the first principle of the 8 principles. So the first principle is that kindness starts with you, which sounds really simple, but when I do workshops with organizations around this, I'd say this principle is the most uncomfortable and the most difficult, because when we think about kindness, the first thought after that usually is, how can I help? Who can I help? Where do I go to help? We're immediately into what needs fixing, what needs changing, who needs our help. And we just go external with that. And kindness starts with you is about saying that, like, fundamentally, if you are not kind to yourself, if you are living in busyness, a sense of scarcity, and you're not living in a sense of abundance, then when the opportunity for kindness comes, you'll run past it, or you'll tell yourself stories and you'll say things like, there isn't enough time, so I'm not going to be kind, or there isn't enough, or I am not enough. And that's a very scarcity mindset. And, we have to really flip that into an abundance mindset where we're saying things like, there is enough time, there is enough, and I am enough. So an example of that for leaders, and actually for anyone listening, is that when you start kindness with you, when you actively prioritize your own self-care, then what happens is you're role modeling
Absolutely.
for 2 different audiences, right? So you're role modeling for everybody else around you, and they'll say things like, well, Graham leaves on time, so he is showing me that it's okay for someone in this organization to leave on time and to prioritize the school run or whatever else is going on, or just, having a proper relaxation this evening, right? So you're role modeling it for that audience, but you're also role modeling it for your own headspace. So you're putting your mind into abundance rather than scarcity. And so guess what? The next time you're on the tube and, you're sat down and someone gets on who needs a seat, your mind is going, there's enough. And you look around and you go, right, I'm going to be the one who stands up. Or you do that little look around where everyone else is. Are you going to stand up, or are you going to stand up? And then, you either sort of communicate with someone else or you stand up. And so, I think when we tell ourselves a story of scarcity, which everywhere around us we're being encouraged to do, right? You scroll Instagram for 5 minutes. What is it? It's you are not enough. Scarcity the whole time. Everything to do with work is set up where it's we're all told stories about how everything needs to be done 5 minutes ago, and there isn't enough resource for the things that we really need, and we're told scarcity over and over again. If you live in that mindset, it's really hard to be kind to other people. So kindness starts with you. And so I do workshops around this, and I get people to sit down and just either meditate to themselves or talk to the person next to them and say the phrases, I am enough, there is enough. And it triggers people. It's really deep. The kind of the felt sense of scarcity within people's bodies. And so that is a really uncomfortable thing to sort of acknowledge. I have some personal experience of this as well. So my son has multiple special needs, and I've been someone who for a long time has sort of voted generally for things that do not preserve my own situation, right? So I'll vote for more money to go into the NHS, or I'll vote for putting taxes up to make other things better, or whatever, which is against my own self-interest. And I've always sort of had, it's kind of easy to have a kind of smug sort of liberal sort of mindset around that kind of stuff. And then my son, he needs a lot of help, right? I just talking to him the other day. So he's 12. And we realized that he's had 11 surgeries in his life, right? In 12 years. And we've just been off the back of doing 7 spinal surgeries in 3.5 years.
Wow, man.
And these things are super expensive. And also his life is on the line. You sign his life away every time you do a spinal surgery. Also his mobility is on the line. There's one of the big side effects is paralysis. So you're in this situation where you're in systems and you're really vulnerable and you are the receiver, and it's very clear, and if you, in our society, if you earn, above averagely, you can often go years and years where you don't really have to ever be the receiver, right? You've got enough food, you've got enough clothes, and you can give some money to charity and feel smug about it, whatever, but you're not really the one who needs help. But yeah, my son has really sort of given me that as a gift, really, the experience of having to be on the receiving end and having to be humble enough to just accept things.
It's a bit like that advice that we should get better at asking for help. You've had to accept it so much that it's probably quite humbling, actually.
It really is. And it also makes giving more pleasurable, because then when you're on the front foot again and you're able to help someone else, you kind of, you're feeling that vulnerability in a way that, honestly, before him, I had a good few years where I had a good run, and money was good and life was good and health was good and everybody else's health was fine. And it just didn't really feel like I was living in any kind of crisis. And yeah, I think it really sort of strengthens your giving when you practice receiving a bit more. So yeah, I think there's a lot to
zero-sum attitude. We can fall into the attitude that I can only give if I've got stuff to give, as if it's a zero-sum game. And of course, that if I've got 10 things and I give you one, I've now got 9, sure. So on some level, there's some scenarios where that's true, but it's also just not. When we give, we let go, first of all, which is a gift to ourselves in a different way. And so much serendipity occurs anyway, or you realize just how interdependent we are. There's this codependence, independence thing, which is, I think, the self-other dichotomy we kind of spoke about earlier. And in this moment, the focus on oneself is not necessarily selfish. It helps us help others a lot more, or it helps us be on the receiving end, which others love. That thing. There's no better way to be happy than to focus on the happiness of others. So
Absolutely,
it's a paradox.
Yeah, and they call it. There's the science around this. They call it the helper's high, where your body releases dopamine and oxytocin, so you build your trust levels, you feel satisfied. Really good outcomes around your own mental health by giving, right? And so I think there's something really valuable about sort of playing on both sides of it. Being aware of how good it is to give, but also to sort of practice receiving and being humble enough to receive. Really important. That thing you're just saying about interdependence and and independence, like for me, that's probably one of the other things that I've really learned through the process of parenting and through writing this book, is that, and maybe this sort of brings us back actually to where you started the conversation around the energies around productivity versus the energy around kindness, is that like the energy of productivity is very individualistic, right? And it very much is a sort of independence movement, the productivity movement. So all of it is about, how can I screen the rest of the world out? How can I get my things done? How can I optimize me? It's very me. So it's a very kind of independent way of thinking, and kind is a very interdependent way of thinking. And I think the biggest thing for me that I've recognized through my son and through this book is, and sort of writing the book, is that we constantly, as a society, seem to want to prioritize independence as if it's the highest form, and that it's above interdependence. And I actually just think it's the other way around. And, you look at moments like, COVID is probably the most obvious recent example, where when the stuff really hits the fan, what people care about actually is everyone okay? Like, you can have all the flex, you can have all the, here's my car, here's my this, here's my that. But when, stuff goes wrong, what were people doing? People were like, we're going to come out and bang the pots and pans for the NHS. We're going to support key workers. We're going to dive in and help with stuff. We're going to launch fundraisers. Like, everybody goes very quickly into what does the collective need, as much as you have the few moments where people are nicking the toilet rolls.
Yeah, that's what that came to mind. But I'm thinking, if productivity is hyper independence, I think niceness is hyper codependence, and kindness is the integration of both, potentially.
Yeah, and then kind is the hyper interdependence.
Yeah,
because that's the other thing with my son, is there's a lot of stuff he can't do. All right, so he's at a special school. He can't really do sport. He doesn't really read. Like, there's lots of stuff where he's going to have challenges throughout his life. But I'll tell you what, like, it was embarrassing for me in his primary school. He's just moved schools, but in his old school, the embarrassing thing for me was that every single parent in the school knew his name, and he was like a little mini celebrity. And the thing that he could do that most of the other neurotypical, typically abled kids couldn't do, is they could not light up a room. They were not like a vehicle for kindness. They were not someone who everyone just wanted to interact with. Like, he's like a magnet for people. And I think whilst he, like, you could look at him on a balance sheet financially, as I've heard certain politicians do recently, particularly thinking about the way reform at the moment talk about disability is horrendous. And I'm very scared by some of the rhetoric around that. So you could look at his numbers on a balance sheet and you would say he would cost our community, our society, like a lot of money. his education costs more than a standard education. He's had all these operations. He needs adjustments for staff. Like whenever we go out and we take someone else with us, and we get an extra free ticket to take someone else with us. Like all these things are massive financial costs. And if you just look at it through the lens of like independence, then he's a massive cost. But if you actually look at what he is teaching everybody else in that class,
yeah, beautiful,
what he is bringing in terms of the happiness and the satisfaction and the helper's high and all of that stuff that he brings to the people around him, like society is richer.
it probably
For the
creates
fact that
community.
he is a bit different and that he is adding a different color to the experience that everyone else is having. And that's why I think interdependence is such an important thing to think about, because it kind of recognizes, there'll be loads of stuff where he needs some help, and there'll also be loads of stuff where he's adding some value to. And like that thing is going to ebb and flow. And I think it's just a much more nuanced way of seeing the world than thinking in sort of pure like economic, financial, what is your economic unit value to the rest of society.
It's why I was so hesitant earlier to even ask you to explain why we should be kind, because our obsession with measuring everything is slightly absurd. Like, I'm even thinking as a football fan, a lot of football fans are annoyed at how much data there is in football, because they actually feel like players are starting to play like robots rather than like artists, which is, when you think back to Gaza or George Best, you're not thinking scientifically here. You're just like, I don't know what just happened, but that was cool. And when we measure love out of everything, it's absurd, and it doesn't lead to kindness, because that reductionist thinking ultimately divides. I even feel it in our work. Engagement scores in an organization, like that's kind of the bread and butter, and it's a bit like, that feels so simplistic. Ultimately, I'm aware of time, and I'd love to capture a couple more kindfulness principles before I've got it might be too meaty a question. We'll see. But when you spoke about scarcity, it reminded me of another one of your principles, which is slow down, and it's because you specifically mentioned scarcity. Of course, the scarcity of money, the scarcity of time. When I read that in the book, I was like, I think most of the time I'm an asshole, or just a little bit brief with someone, or was just a bit self-involved, actually, is probably the best way to put it. It's typically because I am under the illusion that I'm in a rush. Now, I'm not saying there's not moments where I could be in a rush, but a lot of the time I think the rush isn't true. So could you speak a bit more to slowing down? So I also would add in our work, see it with leaders, and the effect the rushing has on the culture is actually quite expensive, I'd say.
Yeah. So here's the thing. The biggest source of accidental unkindness is busyness. So it's not our intent. It's not, are we a good person? It's not, that we don't like the other person, whatever. It's just that we were too busy. There's very few situations where people are on the receiving end of unkindness, and that person was deliberately going out to be unkind. Most of the time that we experience unkindness, it's just someone, they just didn't know what they were getting wrong. Like they were rushing through life. They were self-obsessed, as you're just saying, like, just too in their own heads and too busy. And I do this all the time, right? So this is, you don't write a book about kindness and then absolve yourself from all responsibility here. But the biggest source of accidental unkindness is busyness. And then it comes back to, why are we busy? And then it comes back to why kindness starts with you is the most important principle, because what starts to happen in our heads is, we have this negative self-talk. There's not enough time, so we need to crack on. We don't have time to jump in and help that person or whatever it is. And I've really kind of battled my own self-talk over the years, where you get this sense that if I've had a good week, then my little kind of self chatter is like, but have a better one, and you're just constantly always a little bit moving the goalposts further away from you. And I think that just happens to so many of us, particularly anyone who's found themselves in a leadership position, or running a business, or starting something, or being a high performer. Like, you're probably there partly because you do have a bit of a sort of chippy self-talk that has driven you at some point, right? And so that can often be a bit of a battle mentally, where it's like there's some usefulness to this, but also there's a point where it becomes a very destructive force and destructive energy. So yeah, slowing down, just really, really important. I interviewed Carl Honore for the book, who's someone I've come across a few times over the years, and yeah, we get on really well. But yeah, he said that slowness. What do you say? Slowness is the maternity ward of kind, where basically you can't get to kindness unless you incorporate an aspect of slowness. And one of his favorite things, in terms of his definitions of slowness, is the word savoring, which I think is really important. So slowness isn't always about the speed. It sounds like it is, but it's often just, are you fully in that thing that you're doing? Are you present with it? Are you focused on it fully? Are you immersed in it fully? And so the idea of savoring, I mean, we can all listen to a piece of music, but like, there are those times when we really hear the music and are really touched by it. And I think in everything that we do, food's a really good one. How many times do you eat? You're sort of spooning it in while you're also scrolling or thinking about something else, whatever, versus how many times you sat there going, yeah, like this, I'm really kind of appreciating the flavors, or, appreciating how my tummy feels as I'm eating. And so I think when we slow down, often it's when we're able to savor. And again, when we savor, those are usually the times where we're more present. And through being more present, we notice more. So we notice there's an opportunity to be kind here, or we notice that person might need something over there. And so, yeah, slowness ends up becoming the thing that sort of greases the wheels for other kind acts.
And as leaders, that has a direct effect on the quality of our attention, which is just transformative in a group. I'm really aware more and more that what a leader does versus how they are in a room.
Yeah.
Like, I would rather get loads of stuff wrong, but show up with attention on the group, on what's needed, and that makes a massive difference. And you're right, when I'm in a rush, typically when I'm in a rush, my attention is on what's next, and I'm not on what's now. It's like that difference between listening and waiting to speak. Waiting to speak is some version of not being present, because I'm actually waiting for the next moment, as opposed to listening, savoring, or in Carl's words, just what that person's saying in that very moment.
For sure. Yeah, I started the opening words of Kind. So there's a quote in every chapter, and the opening quote is from Maya Angelou, and I'm sure many of you will know this quote. But yeah, the quote: "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And I think that is such a good, like, that could be a book on its own. You could just print that and give that to leaders and just say, just remember that, and I think, you can have these long manuals about leadership and long manuals about how to manage people and all the rest of it. But if you just bring it back to that one quote, I think that's just a really good place to start, isn't it?
I think a lot of our desire to optimize is behind this. I'm aware I promised we'd stop under the hour, and we've not. And I've still got one question I have to ask you. So if
you can edit out some of my waffle from earlier to make sure it gets to the Spotify 59-minute.
Right. I wanted to ask you before we leave about kindness with people we disagree with, dislike, or perhaps sometimes hate or are angry at. Because I see one of my biggest fears in the world right now, there's a few to choose from, right? I could go for climate, AI, autocracies, war, pandemics, etc., etc. But I'm more worried and affected day to day by polarization. There's an awful, I need to go and find the actual stat, but there's a long-standing poll in the US where they look at the likelihood of somebody being friends with somebody from the other party, and I believe it might even been getting married. And I think 100 years ago, so it's not 100 years ago, maybe I think it might be the 50s or something. It's a long-standing poll. It used to essentially be, and I'm making up the data, but it was like it used to be 70-30. People are likely to be friends with the other party, and now it's the opposite. It's only 30% likelihood.
Wow.
So our ability to be friends with people we disagree with is totally transformed. And I was saying this to you in the pub. I see it a lot at the moment. People saying, calling someone from the other party a fucking Tory because they vote for a different party than them. And to me, there is just, and I mean, it's the same kind of person I've literally seen, I've got someone in mind wear a t-shirt saying choose love at the same time and as saying that. And so I'm just really thinking it's hard. I'm not saying this is easy. It's hard to be kind with people we totally disagree with. And yet I think it's needed. And I even think it leads to better critical thinking. Because if I can have kindness for someone I totally disagree with, it forces me to listen. When it forces me to listen, I actually start to notice ways in which I could be wrong, or ways in which we're closer than I think. Or I might simply remember that whilst I totally disagree with them, they're people too, and they suffer, and that's enough for me to feel close to them, even though I disagree on various things. So yeah, just anything you've got to give us on polarization and the role of kindness in that.
Yeah, I'll share a little funny in joke from that me and my partner have, which is when we're driving, when we see someone go past in either a really fancy car or those people that have the sort of hot hatchbacks where the exhausts are making a big noise.
Yeah, the souped up Subaru.
Yeah, the souped up Subaru. That's the one. Yeah. So when we see people in fancy cars or in those souped up Subarus, our little joke to each other is, and we look at each other and we just go, "No." It's like, and that comes from an Alain de Botton thing in his book Status Anxiety, where he talks about when you realize that most people who drive Ferraris are really just looking for status, and often it's actually because there is some kind of deficit in a different part of their life. It's like, please, and they're basically saying, please respect me, please like me. And I think there's something really interesting about seeing it in that way, rather than just as you're kind of supposed to see it. There's a line in non-violent communication, which is that every action is, I think it's something like, every action is the expression of an unmet need. And I think this really speaks to that, Donald Trump problem or the Tory problem or whatever, is that like there will be fears, or there will be unmet needs, or there will be ways of thinking that are valid within all the things that you disagree with. And I think it's right to have some curiosity around that. And so your thing about doing meta meditation about Donald Trump, I think, is a really good example of this. And it's actually one of the things I've also done with people in workshops, is got them to think about the people in their own organization that they didn't like or respect, and then got them to do meta meditation around that. And and also so the sort of classic meta meditation where you do, you wish that yourself will be happy and well, and then you do the same thing for neighbors, and the same thing for animals, and the same thing for people you disagree with, and all the rest of it. And so, like, I've often done that with people in organizations, and often what they'll say is like, yeah, I didn't come out of that now saying that I like that person, but like I will have put a few seconds of curiosity about what their unmet needs are, or what might be the things that I could do differently. Or
this doesn't mean you totally reversed your politics or opinions at all. Yeah, it doesn't have to do that.
Yeah, and so I think for me the thing then comes down to being kind versus being nice again, because I think yeah, the nice instinct around Donald Trump is definitely something that he wouldn't respect,
Mm,
because
mm,
it would be shirking the truth. And whereas having boundaries and having strong conviction in what you think is right,
mm,
even if it completely is the polar opposite of what they're thinking,
mm.
has to then be something that is respected. So, yeah, I think we are in a polarized time. I've definitely noticed that with this book, because this book came out. Fun fact: this book came out in the States the day after Donald Trump's inauguration.
Mm.
Complete accident. It was just coming out in January that year, and it just happened to be the day after. But it's definitely been,
That might have helped your sales.
yeah, it's definitely been helpful in terms of the marketing of it, because there's a lot of people saying we need more kindness. Where do we start? And when people start to ask that question of me in relation to stuff like Donald Trump, it's like, I don't know.
Mm,
It's like I don't think writing a book about kindness gives you any kind of magic wand there. But I do think having more curiosity about the things that your enemies believe in, or the things that people who are diametrically opposed to you might believe in, is really important. And I do things like, I'm not on Twitter/X anymore. But when I was, I used to deliberately follow quite a lot of people who I really disagreed with, not to bark at them in the comments. Like, I wouldn't get into, sort of big debates, but just to kind of listen to how that thought process
mm,
is. I do the same now on things like YouTube. I'll watch stuff like Jubilee debates with
mm,
people who I really like fundamentally disagree with. But just to try and get some insight. I've actually got a really good friend of mine, is a guy in Charleston, South Carolina, very conservative state. He's very staunch Republican, very religious. Interestingly, does not like Trump,
mm.
but would never vote for a Democrat. I think he did. I think he did vote against Trump the first time around, and I don't think he voted the last time. But having conversations with him is really interesting, because we often end up actually at a commonality in the middle,
Right.
like where both of us want really the same thing, and we both actually are quite critical of people on our own side of politics as
Mm,
well, which maybe makes us both unusual. I don't know, but I think there's so few opportunities now to get outside of your bubble,
mm,
and the way to do it is to do it really deliberately with the algorithms. Use the algorithms against themselves.
mhm,
And I know I have a friend of mine who's got an Instagram account, which is like a burner account,
mm,
and he just follows like Tommy Robinson and all this kind of stuff that he really disagrees with on there, just so he can see what are those people being
mm.
advertised and what are those people commenting on. And like, I think we need to have more curiosity if we're gonna
Well,
stop
one of
it too
your
long.
principles was be humble. I think it speaks
Yeah,
directly to that.
yeah,
I mean, with
sure.
that said, I think when we are doing those kinds of things, which I totally agree with, when there's an election, I actually go and subscribe to like 5, 6 different papers so that I'm getting different points of view. But you have to then
Mm.
extend your mind to say, don't confirmation bias. Don't look for everything you disagree with to reinforce your existing point of view. Try and actively, it really is a critical thinking job, like ask yourself
Yeah.
constantly what is interesting about this.
What's their unmet need,
Mm,
or
mm,
what's their belief about the world?
mm.
I think those are really important questions to sort of keep in mind.
And don't turn kindness into a new status game, which is what Will Storr talks about. That
Mm.
Zuckerberg shows up in the room and everyone else is wearing the best suit and he's wearing flip flops and he's just said, "I don't even play your game." But then, how do I compete with Zuckerberg? I say, "Oh, I'm not into wealth. I'm into being a good person." And then it's like, "Oh, I'm now playing the virtue status game." So we all get lost. Ultimately, I guess we're all trying our best. Graham, this has been great. Thanks. I'm well aware we could go on we've gone over and we could go for way longer. So thanks. Before we end, just any place you'd like to guide people towards online to find more about your work, to find your book, give us something there.
Yeah, sure. So, Kind is available in all good bookshops and the bad one. That's the first thing to say. And if you want to just connect with me, yeah, I'm quite active on LinkedIn. And I also do this weekly email. It's called Rev Up for the Week, and it goes out every Sunday. I send it out 4:05 p.m. UK time, and it's basically just one simple idea that's either productive or kind for the week ahead. So just a good way to start your week. So if you want to subscribe to that, just head to grahamallcott.com. So it's double L double T, grahamallcott.com, and you'll just find a little form on the homepage there just to fill that in, and I just send that out every week. So that's probably the best way to keep in touch with everything I'm doing.
Beautiful. I'll make sure that's all in the show notes as well. Appreciate your time today. It's been lovely hanging out, mate.
Pleasure. You too. Thanks, John.
Catch you soon.